Verão de 1964. Nova Iorque é agitada por violentos motins. Recontros entre polícias brancos e moradores dos bairros negros transformam-se num banho de sangue. 10 anos de luta pelos direitos civis não puseram fim às injustiças, nem ao racismo de que são vítimas os americanos negros. A ira transbordou após um polícia ter matado a tiro um adolescente negro. Em Harlem, a revolta é personificada por um homem. Malcolm X. Nas fotografias raramente é visto a sorrir. Mantém sempre a expressão de um homem zangado. Nas cidades do Norte, ele era o porta-voz da Nação do Islão, o movimento de negros muçulmanos que rejeitava violentamente a América branca e os seus valores cristãos. No início dos anos 60, a imprensa exagerava um combate que tanto aterrorizava como tranquilizava a América. Malcolm X contra o reverendo Martin Luther King, dirigente do movimento pelos direitos civis que combatia a segregação nos Estados do Sul. Martin Luther King, o herói da resistência não violenta, era o alvo preferido de Malcolm X.
The white man pays Reverend Martin Luther King, subsidizes Reverend Martin Luther King, so that Reverend Martin Luther King can continue to teach the Negroes to be defenseless.
Martin Luther King nunca reagiu aos ataques de Malcolm X. Nunca aceitou um debate com ele. Da única vez que se encontraram, em Washington, os dois homens apertaram as mãos, mas mal se falaram. Mas uma fotografia permanece gravada nas memórias. Uma imagem que une os dois sonhos opostos da causa negra.
We have a lot of kids here now, they want to hang on the corner, they want to sell drugs, they want to do this, and they don't realize that there was one time in our life that we couldn't even be outside without having a problem, without the cops harassing us or trying to kill us, you know what I'm saying? So I try to let them know and try to make them understand that freedom is not free. Every day people die for freedom. Freedom is not free. And these two men died just so we could have basic rights, just so I could walk down the street and not be harassed and be able to, you know, do normal things like everybody else.
These were the watchmen of the time. They came and they risked life. When you told Martin, if you go out and speak to your people, you're gonna die. Martin still had the determination to die for what he was going to say. They told Malcolm the same thing. If you go out and speak to your people, you're gonna die. But they had determination to look death in the face and say, I'm going to speak in spite of.
That's
and
right.
when you can get into your true nature, you look like Woo! You act like Malcolm, and you look like Martin, and you act like Martin. You ready to die for what you believe in because you know there's no greater cause than for you to be the greatest human being that God placed on this planet. That's your motto. That's your motto.
Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, walking up to freedom's land. The Civil Rights Movement was a singing movement. We were in the Deep South, and African-American people were church-going people, and for the most part were in Christian churches. One thing Martin Luther King brought, he too was a preacher, Baptist preacher. A message he brought was, we must take the church out of these four walls. That's a direct quote from Martin. We must take the church out of these four walls and let the teaching of that church and the theory and thesis from the churches and the essence of the sermons We must take it where the problems are.
Martin Luther King teve o seu batismo político no Alabama, um dos estados mais racistas do Sul, onde muitos brancos continuavam a agir como se a escravatura não tivesse sido abolida um século antes. Em Montgomery, King organizou uma campanha para boicotar os autocarros. Foi o início de uma luta épica contra as leis segregacionistas que mantinham brancos e negros separados em locais públicos e que negavam o voto aos negros.
You don't not only have a right to be free, we have a duty to be free. Yeah. And so when you sit down on the bus and you sit down in the front or you sit down by a white person, you are sitting there because you have a duty to sit there, not merely because you have a right. You have a duty to sit there because as long as you sit in the back, you have a false sense of inferiority. And so long as you let the white man sit in the front and push you back there, he has a false sense of superiority.
King was working to take down signs that prevented black people from riding buses where they wanted to and to ride in train, public transportation, preventing them from voting and all of those things that black people were prevented from doing in the South. But in the North, blacks have always could vote. But as Malcolm said, you may have the vote, but you end up voting for nothing because they've already decided that you're not going to have any power.
I moved to Harlem in the summer of 1962. And I moved in on a Friday night. Saturday morning we got up. Instead of unpacking all of that, we decided we were going to walk down the main street in Harlem, which was Lenox Avenue, which is now Malcolm X Boulevard, and see what, and just look at the community. When we got down close to Lenox Avenue, we saw a crowd gathering. So we said, what's going on? And they said, the Malcolm X is going to speak. We'd heard of him, you know, the boogeyman. He was the boogeyman and bleeding violence and shooting, killing white folks and all that kind of stuff. But that's mainly what we had heard. So we said, let's hear what he's got to say.
It is time for you and me to see for ourselves. It is time for you and me to hear for ourselves. And it is time for you and me to fight for ourselves. We don't need anybody today speaking for us, seeing for us, or fighting for us.
He spent a lot of time talking about the psychological attacks of white supremacy, the attacks on our minds. And that to me was like completely eye-opening when I began to hear, and I began to, cause to realize all the things that had been happening to me as a child growing up and other things that I now realize were a part of that, the movies, you know, all of those things were a part of that psychological attack to make us feel inferior.
One has to realize that to call a person black in the 50s and 60s was an insulting thing to do. It was Malcolm X who almost single-handedly transformed the racial consciousness of black people so that they no longer were ashamed of being black.
The Honorable Elijah Muhammad has stopped us from stealing, and we did steal. He stopped us from gambling, and he stopped us from lying. Stealing runs rampant in Harlem. Gambling runs rampant in Harlem. All types of evils and vices that tear apart our community run rampant in Harlem.
No Harlem, todos conheciam a história de Malcolm Little, o jovem vadio que descobriu a nação do Islão e o seu profeta, Elijah Muhammad. Foi Muhammad que fez de Malcolm X o porta-voz do movimento separatista negro, com a sua visão racial, na qual os muçulmanos negros viveriam separados dos brancos. Graças a Malcolm X, a nação do Islão tornou-se popular nos guetos dos Estados do Norte.
A lot of people that were addicted cleaned themselves up, put on suits, and they had a belief in the Nation of Islam. Whereas at that point, Christianity, whether it was white Christianity, black liberation Christianity, was not reaching them. But Malcolm did, and it cleaned up a lot of young men that had fallen on the way, who were just being marginal people. And he gave them a sense of being proud of themselves, of being black.
Well, the organization was always one that was concerned about offering an option and an alternative to black Americans. You know, here's something, what we're talking about in terms of the goals and objectives we have is far cry what you have. You know, you're following Christianity, for example. Well, that's connected to the slave trade. That's connected to your slaveholder. You know, he does not have your best interests in mind. He's giving you a religion that tamps down your potential for violence and raising up.
Minister X, you have described the Muslim movement as a religious organization, and you've said that there are a great many misconceptions about your attitudes and stated views. Could we press for a very simple answer to one question? Do you hate all white people?
I don't think it's a fair question. The white man doesn't even come into my attitude. Mr. Muhammad teaches us to love our own kind and let the white man take care of himself. For a white man today, sir, after kidnapping millions of black people from Africa, stripping them of all human characteristics and relegating them to the role of chattel or cattle or animals, commodity, merchandise that could be bought and sold at will, and then 100 years since the Emancipation Proclamation, using every type of deceptive method to further us into slavery, called second-class citizenship, I think that it would take a whole lot of nerve for white people today to ask Negroes, do they hate them?
Okay.
Malcolm spoke to the white media, but he was not trying to convince the white media that what he was saying was true, because he knew that they were going to distort what he said. But King, on the other hand, an artist of the spoken word, he was always trying to get the attention of the media, to use the media to support his nonviolent approach to social change.
Depois da anulação das leis de segregação nos autocarros do Alabama, King continuou a sua ação noutros estados do Sul, afirmando-se como o líder do movimento dos direitos civis.
We do not want to wait 50 years for our rights. We don't want to wait 25 years for our rights. We don't want to wait 10 years for our rights. We want all of our rights. We want them here, and we want them now. This is the meaning of the revolution.
O jovem pastor tornou-se uma celebridade, com a imprensa a louvar a eficácia da sua abordagem não violenta. King e os seus lugares-tenentes utilizavam a televisão com grande perícia. À frente das câmaras, procuravam provocar a violência das autoridades. Os manifestantes eram ensinados a não mostrar hostilidade para com o adversário, resistindo pacificamente.
King very, very rarely, in his public comments, speaks about appealing to television. He talks about appealing to the conscience of the nation. But of course, you can't appeal to the conscience of the nation if you're not doing so through a national medium, and television news, in its early heyday in this period, is the most direct way to get to a national audience.
The method of nonviolent resistance is one of the most potent, if not the most potent weapons available to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom.
Nas cidades do norte, a mensagem da não-violência caía em orelhas mocas. Malcolm X visitava regularmente esquadras para denunciar a violência policial.
I'm not satisfied with the fact that the police in this downtown area has punched one of our brothers in the mouth, and the brother wasn't breaking any law. He was only selling papers, and it would be dangerous for them to get the impression that we endorse Martin Luther King's philosophy of turn the other cheek.
Malcolm represented the kind of attitude and political perspective of many of young black so-called militants and radicals coming out of urban areas in the North. They have a different kind of attitude. It was hard for them to swallow this notion of nonviolence. You know, somebody go upside my head, then retribution is coming. I can't see myself falling down on my knees and giving any kind of extra advantage to my enemy. Malcolm said, somebody hit you, you send them to the cemetery.
The nonviolent strategy of Martin Luther King Jr. for Malcolm X was a weak philosophy. It was a philosophy of turn the other cheek. It was a philosophy of not hitting back. And Malcolm comes from a black nationalist tradition that does not believe that you can get your freedom, your self-respect, your dignity by simply letting somebody beat up on you and you not try to defend yourself. That's why Malcolm emphasized self-defense. But King emphasized nonviolence because if blacks had responded trying to defend themselves, that would have brought down the police department down on those demonstrators, and whites would have loved to have the chance to kill black people indiscriminately. So King and Malcolm had that tension.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation.
A televisão desempenhou um papel central na luta dos afro-americanos pela igualdade. Em 1963, uma série de acontecimentos cobertos por jornalistas dos canais nacionais revelaram aos americanos a escala do problema negro no Sul. A relação de Martin Luther King com o presidente Kennedy, que assumiu o cargo 2 anos antes, foi vital para a sua estratégia. Mas foi esta aliança entre King e Washington, este quadro idílico de reconciliação entre negros e brancos, que provocou a ira de Malcolm X. Tudo começou em Birmingham, no Alabama, na primavera de 1963. Martin Luther King e outro pastor, Ralph Abernathy, foram filmados a ser presos por organizarem uma manifestação não autorizada. A detenção fazia parte de uma estratégia que King usava para cada campanha. Era importante que as câmaras captassem a agitação. King e o seu movimento escolheram Birmingham porque era um bastião do racismo no Sul, uma cidade onde os brancos gostavam de repetir o slogan do seu governador: segregação hoje, segregação amanhã, segregação para sempre.
What the SCLC and King realized is this has to be a national crisis. This has to be a national emergency. And how do we make it national?
King believed that Alabama would not and could not police itself, and that what he wanted to do was to show that, so that the federal government would have to become involved and thereby make a federal law that would override anything that any of the Jim Crow laws that's in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963.
Foi na prisão que Martin Luther King escreveu o texto que resumia o seu combate, a Carta da Cadeia de Birmingham. King escreveu: o objetivo do nosso programa de ação direta é criar uma situação tão crítica que abrirá inevitavelmente a porta à negociação. Depois da intervenção do presidente Kennedy, King não demorou a ser libertado. Poucos dias depois, King e os seus seguidores criaram uma polémica à escala nacional.
One of his lieutenants suggests, well, why don't we have school children? They don't have jobs, they don't have mortgages. A lot of controversy about that within King's circle. But the decision is made, and so we have hundreds and hundreds of children marching. And that's also the moment when Bull Connor, the public safety commissioner, decides to bring out attack dogs and high-powered fire hoses. Now, of course, the media is still all over this story, both the print media, photojournalists, and television, which, of course, is still a fairly new medium as far as news and journalism. Those pictures go around the world. When we get these incredibly dramatic images, they are so powerful. And here we have a story of two opposing forces, one behaving brutally, the other being victimized. And so, for television, this is a spectacular story. Malcolm X is quoted in the media being very, very critical about King and the movement, allowing children to march and be arrested and be brutalized. And he says, it becomes a very famous quote. He says, nobody should put women and children in harm's way. King is not a champ, he's a chump.
That was our main criticism of Birmingham. The fact that that children were being put in this. And from what I understand, even some of the King people kind of, had a problem with that. Initially, they had a problem with that.
Interestingly, it's at that moment that the coverage of King starts to change, because very shortly after this particular campaign, it's called the Children's Campaign. Very shortly after that, the white power structure in Birmingham basically collapses, agrees to King's demands. The media coverage of King then very quickly changes. He's not the militant anymore. He's the hero.
2 dias depois da sua vitória sobre as autoridades locais, Martin Luther King foi alvo de um ataque. Vários edifícios foram incendiados por extremistas brancos. Pouco depois, os negros amotinaram-se. Perante a agitação, John F. Kennedy enviou a Guarda Nacional para os arredores de Birmingham. Em Harlem, Malcolm X deu largas à sua indignação.
We are not integrationists, and we believe that you're a fool to try and mix with someone who doesn't love you. Well, that doesn't mean that we in any way condone what those crackers are doing in Birmingham, Alabama. Our people should know better, and it is no accident that as long as the dogs were biting Negro women, Negro babies, and Negro children, Kennedy said nothing. It was only after the Negroes began to strike back. It was then that Kennedy called in the army. So don't you be fooled by Kennedy. Don't you be fooled by these Uncle Tom Negro preachers. When the dog attacks you, you get that dog, two-legged dog or four-legged dog. Thank you.
Depois dos acontecimentos de Birmingham, Martin Luther King e Malcolm X foram entrevistados com poucos dias de intervalo para um programa sobre a questão da raça. Foi uma oportunidade para mostrarem ao público as suas visões opostas da causa negra.
Malcolm X has said of your philosophy that it plays into the hands of the white oppressors, that they are happy to hear you talk about love for the oppressor because this disarms the Negro?
Well, I don't think of love as, in this context, as emotional bosh. I don't think of it as a weak force. But I think of love as something strong and that organizes itself into powerful direct action. And I think some of the criticisms of nonviolence, or some of the critics, fail to realize that we are talking about something very strong, and they confuse non-resistance with nonviolent resistance.
King assumes that people already know that he is right about what he is saying, so he is using the intellectual tradition of whites in order to make his point. Malcolm does not use the intellectual tradition of whites to make his point. Malcolm uses the experiences of black people in the ghetto, the people that he's talking to. Your style of speaking, whether Martin or Malcolm, emerges out of the lived experience that you've had.
Reverend Martin Luther King preaches a doctrine of nonviolent insistence upon the rights of the American Negro. What is your attitude toward this philosophy?
The white man pays Reverend Martin Luther King, subsidizes Reverend Martin Luther King, so that Reverend Martin Luther King can continue to teach the Negroes to be defenseless. That's what you mean by nonviolent. Be defenseless. Be defenseless in the face of one of the most cruel beasts that has ever taken the people into captivity. That's this, the American white man.
But the goal of Dr. King is full equality and full rights of citizenship for Negroes.
The goal of Dr. Martin Luther King is to give Negroes a chance to sit in a segregated restaurant beside the same white man who had brutalized them for 400 years. The goal of Dr. Martin Luther King is to get Negroes to forgive the people who have brutalized them for 400 years by lulling them to sleep and making them forgetting what those whites have done to them.
Malcolm criticized Martin because he was trying to win the battle to sit next to white people in a restaurant. But Malcolm says, I mean, that's not freedom. Sitting next to white people is not freedom. What's freedom is black people having their own self-determination where they can buy their own restaurant and they don't have to worry about whites not serving them.
O dia 11 de junho de 63 assinalou uma grande vitória para King e para o seu movimento. O presidente Kennedy fez um discurso televisionado no qual apresentou a situação dos afro-americanos no Sul como uma crise moral que afetava o país inteiro.
But are we to say to the world, and much more importantly, to each other, that this is a land of the free, except for the Negroes, that we have no second-class citizens, except Negroes, that we have no class or caste system, no ghettos, no master race, except with respect to Negroes. Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them.
Poucos dias depois, os dirigentes do movimento pelos direitos civis foram à Casa Branca apresentar à administração Kennedy planos para um grande comício político em Washington. O objetivo era chamar a atenção para as injustiças que continuavam a afetar 20 milhões de negros. A presidência receava que a agitação transbordasse para as ruas da capital, mas King tranquilizou a Casa Branca. O acontecimento veio a ser uma marcha grandiosa e pacífica, realizada nas condições estabelecidas por Kennedy. No dia da marcha, a América inteira pôde seguir o seu progresso ao vivo pela televisão, graças às câmaras instaladas ao longo de todo o percurso. Os 3 canais nacionais deram ampla cobertura ao acontecimento. Foi o culminar de 10 anos de luta pelos direitos civis.
what you see is an emphasis on black and white together. The march was about 3/4 African Americans, 1/4 white. But if you look at the coverage, you would think it was almost 50-50. So one way that television news was framing this monumental phenomenon is of blacks and whites coming together. You see images of marchers, and the emphasis is always on dignity. So you see these framed portraits of marchers. The TV cameras are always looking for well-dressed marchers, and this was part of the organizing of the march. Wear your best clothes, right? You're going to be seen by the nation. So the impulse seems to be, on the day of the march, to portray this for television viewers as non-threatening, as, this is the ideal. This is what integration looks like.
To me, it was almost like a picnic. It had almost like a picnic-like atmosphere to it. I was just like totally unimpressed. And although I was, I had already accepted Brother Malcolm's interpretation of events from listening to him speak, but to me it was when I was there, and I was saying to myself, why would anyone object to this? This is a great coup for the Kennedy administration. Makes them look as though they're doing something, and something major is going on.
I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Now you have 250,000 people, gathered in one place, seemingly on the same page, seemingly there to idolize the kind of iconic value that Dr. King represented at the end. And even the people who organized the march recognized that King would be the centerpiece. A. Philip Randolph in particular, he knew exactly what he was doing, that Dr. King would come on and move that crowd in such a way that no other speaker in this country could do.
I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
Everything is, I have a dream, I have a dream, I have a dream. And to me, the greatest lines from that speech that should be embedded into the minds of especially of young black folks is, the forefathers of this country gave us a promissory note, and we have come here today to cash that check. Now, to me, that's symbolically and in terms of an image creating in the mind, that was a powerful statement. Totally ignored.
But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice.
Para Malcolm X, a marcha sobre Washington era um acontecimento a rejeitar. Num discurso famoso, atacou aquilo a que chamou a farsa sobre Washington.
Same clique that put Kennedy in power joined the March on Washington. It's just like when you got some coffee that's too black, which means it's too strong. What you do, you integrate it with cream. It used to be hot, it becomes cool. It used to be strong, it becomes weak. It used to wake you up, now it'll put you to sleep. This is what they did with the March on Washington. They joined it, became a part of it, took it over. And as they took it over, it lost its militancy. They ceased to be angry. They ceased to be hot. They ceased to be uncompromising. Why, it even ceased to be a march. It became a picnic, a circus. Nothing but a circus with clowns and all. They controlled it so tight, they told those Negroes what time to hit town, how to come, where to stop, what sign to carry, what song to sing, what speech they could make and what speech they couldn't make, and then told them to get out of town by sundown.
A marcha sobre Washington selou uma aliança entre King e Kennedy. A partir dali, King era o interlocutor privilegiado da Casa Branca. Segundo a comunicação social, os dois homens iam escrever a história americana. Mas esta seria escrita sem Kennedy. Segunda-feira, 25 de novembro de 1963. A América inteira estava em choque na sequência do assassinato de Kennedy e assistia ao seu funeral pela televisão. King e a causa negra tinham acabado de perder o seu aliado político mais poderoso. Entretanto, Malcolm X perturbava o ambiente de luto.
When Kennedy is killed, because the grief for the nation was so intense, any quote or soundbite that seems to be critical of Kennedy is just not going to be tolerated.
Malcolm X, second in command of the Black Muslim movement, expressed joy at the assassination of President Kennedy at a Manhattan rally last Sunday. Malcolm said that the killing of the president was an instance of the chickens coming home to roost. He added, and we quote, "Being an old farm boy myself, chickens coming home to roost never make me sad, they always make me glad." In Chicago today, Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the anti-white Muslim movement, suspended Malcolm X and disavowed his statement.
You know, you let the chickens out in the morning, they go around, and they always come back in the evening. What chickens coming on loose basically was the same as saying, what you reap is what you sow. And Brother Malcolm's position was that the Kennedy administration had allowed all of that violence to occur in Birmingham and other places, and had not done very much about it.
But the way that the media, of course, takes up that quote is Malcolm is saying Kennedy deserved to be shot. And since Malcolm has, for so many years been framed as a radical, militant, violent, deviant personality, there's almost no other way that quote would have been read in the mass media.
I personally wish he had not said it, not because it was not true, because I believe every word of it, but because he was able to, it provided ammunition for his enemies, both in the larger world and in the Nation of Islam, to use it against him.
Após 3 meses de silêncio impostos por Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X acabou por ser banido da nação do Islão. Dali em diante, falava apenas em nome próprio.
Do you consider yourself militant? I consider myself Malcolm.
I think when he left the Nation of Islam in March of 1964, he felt, to a great degree, I feel, a kind of a liberatory. He felt liberated. In fact, he at some point said something about the straitjacket is no longer on him. Now he can move and become more political. Because understand that the Nation of Islam tended to tamp down any kind of political expression, to stay clear of that. That's what got Malcolm in trouble when he said something about Kennedy's assassination, about the chickens coming home to roost. Got him into deep water. So, and then that precipitated a number of other moves, but he was already, as far as I'm concerned, he was beginning to step outside of that anyway. He saw himself in a larger picture and making a greater contribution.
What will be the difference between your new movement and the Nation of Islam?
Well, the basic difference will be it'll probably be more flexible, and it's not my intention to teach among Muslims or those who are already Muslims, but to take Mr. Muhammad's message out among the non-Muslim so-called Negroes.
Well, you will work then with Negro groups that are working for integration?
But we won't be joining them, nor will they be joining us, but we will work together on any objective that we have in common, or that will be for the common good of the Negro community.
Em Washington, Martin Luther King prosseguiu seu trabalho político com um grupo de senadores que simpatizavam com as suas ideias. Participou no debate sobre a elaboração da Lei dos Direitos Civis. Iniciada por Kennedy, foi a legislação mais progressista até à data relativa aos afro-americanos. Durante uma conferência de imprensa que deu no Capitólio, King viu um visitante inesperado no fundo da sala. Era Malcolm X.
Malcolm X always wanted to meet King and debate with King. But King always refused to meet with Malcolm, largely because he knew that if he met with Malcolm, support from the white community would be almost eliminated. So King had to carry himself in such a way that the support which he got from the world white community would not dry up.
Após a conferência, os dois homens encontraram-se cara a cara. O encontro que King tinha sempre evitado foi convocado por Malcolm X à frente da imprensa e dos fotógrafos. Durou apenas 1 minuto, mas estas imagens que os captam lado a lado, como esta foto onde estão a sorrir, tornaram-se um forte símbolo da reconciliação entre duas visões opostas da causa negra.
Those two people, Martin and Malcolm, symbolize something that is in all African Americans. Each of us has a little bit of Martin and a little bit of Malcolm in us. See, Malcolm represents that blackness in us, that sense that we don't want white people messing with us. We are Malcolm represents that fire, that fight, that refusal to let anybody define who we are. King represents our desire to get along with everybody, including whites. Our desire to want to create a society for all people, defined by nonviolence, love, and care for all people in the society.
A 2 de julho de 1964, a Lei dos Direitos Civis foi assinada na Casa Branca. O que King viu tornar-se realidade naquele dia foi uma lei federal que punia toda e qualquer discriminação racial nos Estados Unidos. Figurou ao lado do presidente Johnson como um herói vitorioso. Esta lei era, finalmente, a resposta de Washington ao seu sonho. Poucos dias depois, a América viu-se enredada noutro pesadelo. Na sequência da absolvição de um polícia que tinha matado um adolescente negro, instalaram motins em Nova York. Durante 48 horas, a violência reinou nos bairros negros. Quando os lugares-tenentes de King tentaram apaziguar as tensões, os seus apelos à calma não tiveram qualquer efeito na raiva das ruas. Durante os motins foram presas mais de 400 pessoas. Vários agentes da polícia ficaram feridos. Para Malcolm X, era um sinal de que os negros já não estavam dispostos a dar a outra face e que a espiral de violência tinha começado.
In 1600 I was a darky. Until 1865 a slave. In 1900 I was a nigger. Or at least that was my name. In 1960 I was a Negro. And then Brother Malcolm came along. And then some nigger shot Malcolm down. But the bitter truth lives on.
A 21 de fevereiro de 1965, Malcolm X foi assassinado. No início de uma reunião política no Audubon Theatre, em Harlem, 3 homens alvejaram-no à queima-roupa. Um dos assassinos, membro da Nação do Islão, foi preso no próprio dia. Esta morte violenta pôs fim a um dos debates políticos mais famosos na história dos americanos negros. Martin Luther King reagiu publicamente alguns dias mais tarde.
I think Malcolm X did serve a role. I think he played a role in pointing out the problem, calling attention to it. But his great problem was an inability to emerge with a solution. He had slogans that were catchy and that people listened to. But I don't think he ever pointed out the solution to the problem.
O que King não sabia era que, na morte, Malcolm X tornar-se-ia muito mais do que um rival. Transformou-se numa memória, numa consciência revolucionária para uma geração de jovens negros. Cantada nos guetos, a notícia da sua morte ressoaria como uma vingança sobre King.
Six days of rioting in a Negro section of Los Angeles left behind scenes reminiscent of war-torn cities. More than 100 square blocks were decimated by fire and looters. As the National Guard moved in to restore comparative calm, the losses by fire alone were put at $200 million.
Na segunda metade da década de 60, a América entrou num longo ciclo de motins raciais. A atenção da comunicação social deslocou-se do sul para os guetos do norte. King seguiu este movimento. Fez campanhas para denunciar as injustiças económicas que os negros enfrentavam nas principais cidades americanas.
King described riots as temper tantrums of children, of people who don't have an option. Temper tantrum. It's a cry out to say, I'm somebody, I'm here. Listen to me. Look what you're doing to me. And King understood that. And he realized that the same style of resistance that he had used in the South would not work in the North.
Em Washington, estabeleceu-se uma comissão no Senado para investigar a violência crescente nos guetos. King foi convocado para apresentar a sua posição sobre o tópico.
Economic and social. Yes, that's correct, Senator Ribicoff. I think that it is necessary to see at this point that the issues which we confront are the hard core economic issues. For about a decade, we worked on public accommodations and the right to vote. And as I said earlier, it was necessary to do this in order to remove a stigma, in order to remove the humiliation of a caste system. But now we are moving into an area where we must demand basic reforms that will deal with these basic economic issues, a whole problem of housing and education. And I think we've got to see that this is much harder. It was easier to integrate public facilities, it was easier to gain the right to vote because it didn't cost the nation anything.
He was moving into the arena of economics and economic justice. And that was a whole different arena. And a lot of those people who had supported him in trying to get rid of the laws about sitting on the back of the bus and being able to eat at the lunch counter. When they start talking about economics, boy, some of those people they start pulling away. Because this is another ball game.
When you see King in his later life, he begins to refer to all these radical blacks in our tradition who also challenge the government. And so you see King talking about, they've turned my dream into a nightmare. And he began to take a stand against the war in Vietnam. He began to organize a poor people's campaign and fight against poverty. That king was the king who became the radical king. And that's when he began to move toward Malcolm X.
A 4 de abril de 1968, Martin Luther King foi assassinado em Memphis. Poucos dias depois, no seu funeral, a comunidade negra não chorava apenas o seu dirigente nacional. 3 anos após a morte violenta de Malcolm X, estava a despedir-se dos 2 sonhos que tinham moldado a história dos afro-americanos.